Hey guys, today's going to be part 1 of the tutorial on how to make this homemade wood lathe. So this lathe is almost finished at the moment and I've got it to the point where it actually works and I can turn bits of wood on it. It's still not completely finished, I've still got a couple of things to do, but I'll do them in later videos and I feel like I can start to make the tutorials now. This is part 1 of the tutorial, which is going to be on how to make the base of the lathe. This build has been quite complicated and it's probably not the simplest way to make a wood lathe like this. It's probably one of the most complicated ways actually, but this lathe works really well and works so much better than my old wood lathe. If you haven't seen my old wood lathe, there will be a link in the description down below to it. It was basically a very simple lathe to turn very small things and it was powered by a power drill. This lathe, however, is the complete opposite. It's much stronger, made up of lots of welded steel and very strong plywood, and it runs off a 1-phase, 2 horsepower 3-pole motor. This motor is completely overkill and the belt will slip much before you manage to torque out the motor, so I could use a much less powerful motor, but it means that I'm not short of power so that I can turn much larger things and take much more aggressive cuts into the wood. The speed of the lathe can be changed by using the different cone pulleys, and you can tighten the belt just by moving the motor on its mounting. So before the tutorial, I'm just going to give you a couple of clips of the lathe turning some pieces of wood and show you how I set up the lathe and how it works. So I've got 2 different methods at the moment of transferring the actual rotation of the lathe to the rotation of a piece of wood. The first method, and the most effective in my opinion, is also the most simple. The headstock of this lathe runs off an M24 threaded rod with an M8 threaded hole in the middle, and that allows me to add different attachments that I've made. The M24 threaded rod takes M24 threaded bolts, which then can slide on, and then I've taken one of these bolts, welded on some nails, so that I can just hammer that into the back of a long piece of wood and then screw it onto the headstock of the lathe. I counter tighten another nut against that to make sure that it doesn't spin, and then I can turn that piece of wood and it holds it really solidly. The other method that I have is this 4-jaw chuck that I made a while ago, and I actually made a tutorial on how to make this chuck. It's not a very effective chuck and it's not very strong, it's also a bit out of line, so it doesn't really turn the parts true to the rotation of the lathe, but it still works alright for holding square pieces of wood. So once you have your method of what you're going to use to drive the actual piece of wood, you then got to set up all the other things on the lathe to get turning. If it's a slightly longer piece of wood, then you're definitely going to want tailstock support. So then I take the end of the threaded rod and push it into the wood here, which is going to help support it. These bolts all tighten down to hold everything in place. You can use some more bolts to adjust the tool rest so that it's just close to the material. You don't want it to touch the material, but you want it to be just close. And then that's pretty much it. All you have to do is set the speed of the motor on the cone pulleys and you're ready to go. I start off on the slowest speed, and then for sanding I work up to higher speeds. Now that you know how the lathe works, I'm going to go on to the tutorial. The main section of the base is going to be made from these 2 pieces of 50 by 50 square steel tubing. Each piece is a meter long with 3mm thick walls, and they are mild steel so that I can weld them very easily. These pieces are incredibly straight and very strong. I can jump on these and they'll easily take my weight. The design calls for these pieces to have an 8mm gap between them so that I can fit an M8 bolt in there, and then I can tighten everything down onto it. I made the 8mm spacer from a couple of pieces of scrap steel that I had lying around. I just chopped them up, welded them together until they are roughly just over 8mm thick. I sandwiched the spacers between some square steel tubing and then clamped the whole thing down to some plywood to make sure everything was nice and flat. I then did my best job of welding it together, and take in mind that I started making this project absolutely ages ago and I still kind of sucked at welding back then. I still kind of suck at welding now actually. I used the CAD file that I'd made to make a little drawing of the feet which I want to cut out. These pieces were just cut out of some 5mm steel plate with my angle grinder. Then held them in place with my welding magnets around 1 centimeter from the end, and then did my best job of welding them on again. These welds kinda sucked and they looked pretty ugly, so I filed them down a bit. Doesn't really matter, they're still pretty strong. And once all of that was done, then the base was complete. The next step is to build this headstock here, and since this takes quite a long time, I'm going to be covering it in a separate tutorial that will hopefully be finished for next week. Until then, you can follow the progress of my lathe as I build more things for it on Instagram, as I'll be posting upgrades on everything that I do there. If you want to gain early access to any of the videos, you get up to about 5 days early access on all of the videos that I post, then considering supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description down below. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part when I make the headstock.